Hey guys, just a quick update on the podcast for this week. Part 1 came out this morning. This week we are talking with another Georgia family, the Sullivan family. You probably have already seen a couple posts that I've put up with Diana, so you guys could get to know her before you hear her story. She is so sweet, and this story is going to wreck you. Quick synopsis is her and her husband go through 14 years of IVF. First, they have their daughter, Arabella. After a lot of failed attempts with IVF, they are pregnant with twins. The pregnancy was not smooth. Diana had a lot of medical issues. She was diagnosed with preeclampsia. She had preterm labor with the twins. Amelia, the girl, was diagnosed with IUGR. And basically what that means is that the placenta does not grow, and it also does not pass the nutrients that the baby needs in order to grow and develop the way they should. In addition, the placenta restricts her. Because she can't move, babies moving within their placenta is a key part of bone development. Like kicking their legs and stuff like that, that's what makes their bones grow and develop properly. And because she wasn't able to do that, that was a huge problem. When the preterm labor started, like sometimes it would take days to stop. One of the doctors had told Diana that she was going to need to have a C-section because the baby, who was way down low, Amelia, she was weighing at less than 1 percentile. Because of her small size, the contractions in childbirth would have crushed her body. That's why they told her that she was going to need to have a C-section. The babies are born. Amelia's in the NICU for 42 days. Christian also had to stay for a little bit. Before they're released from the hospital, this crazy incident happens, and you really have to hear it on the podcast to understand. But every single time I hear it, I just am overwhelmed and start crying. So I'm not going to tell you about it. I'll let you wait and hear it from Diana herself. But basically there was a choking incident where some hospital equipment malfunctioned and Diana was left to try and save her baby herself. And she had to give stimulation to the back of the baby, which was another thing that we look back at and say these injuries were dated to this time. The babies are finally released from NICU. Amelia's still struggling to grow. So Diana would do the night feedings for Christian because he was able to nurse. Her husband, Corey, would do Amelia's feedings in the middle of the night because he could bottle feed her. One night, Corey was doing a night feeding, looking at his baby, and noticed that her thigh was swollen. It was swollen enough that he was really worried about it. So he went and woke up Diana. They both looked at it and they were like, we need to get to the ER and figure out what's going on. There was no fall. There was nothing that they could think of that could have caused a broken femur. They raced to the hospital, and when they get there, an x-ray tells them that Amelia has a broken femur, and they're in shock. The only thing that they could think of was the dad was like, I noticed when we were driving home yesterday that I had put the strap in the infant car seat on wrong. Is it possible that putting it on wrong created enough pressure to break a femur? And the hospital was like, no, that can't be it. They were like, well, she had IUGR or any of these things related to the broken femur. And they were trying to ask and figure out what was wrong with their baby. And the hospital was just basically dismissing everything they said. They say, we can't handle the broken bone here. It was a smaller hospital. It wasn't a children's hospital. They tell them, we need to move you to Wolfson's over in Florida. This happened in Camden County, which is in Georgia, but right near the border. They're like, okay, great. Like whatever we need to do, we need to help her. They're waiting to find out about being transported to Wolfson's over in Florida. A nurse comes in and tells them that ground transport is going to be hours out. And they were like, well, we can't make her just sit here waiting for hours. And the nurse said, well, we could fly you down. They're like, yeah, we'll worry about the expense of that later. We need to get her to the hospital. In the hospital, they were trying to get an IV line into Amelia. They could not get it in. They were holding down her wrists and holding down her ankles. They weren't able to get it in, and the baby's screaming, crying. She is not having it, and Diana's just watching this, and they're like poking at her over and over, and they're not getting a line. Finally, she was like, can you guys stop torturing her? So the nurse basically just did a heel stick. When they went to put the baby into the helicopter, they were getting her buckled into it. Again, tried to get an IV line in her before the helicopter took off. and they were holding down her wrists and her ankles, all of the usual spots for IVs, and they just couldn't get one. So they eventually gave up as well, and Diana's like being tortured watching her baby get poked over and over. They fly Amelia to Wolfson's, and then all of a sudden it was like a series of doctors coming in one after the next saying she doesn't just have a femur fracture, she has rib fractures. There's also something on her wrists and her ankles. At one point, the doctor came in and was like, there's a stage 3 liver laceration and it's bleeding internally. And it was just like one thing after the next. And so she's asking, like, could it have happened when I was having contractions? Could it have happened because of her IUGR? Could it be a metabolic bone disorder? Could it have been the way the seatbelt in the car seat was on her leg? Could it be like any of these things? And no matter what she said, they were like, no, it could not be. Dr. Barbara Knox enters the scene. And if we haven't spoken about her before, let me tell you about her now. This doctor she's a child abuse pediatrician. When she started, I think she started off in Wisconsin. In Wisconsin, there was investigation into her because people were saying that she was calling things abuse that were not abuse. So there was this big investigation. There were newspaper articles about her calling things that were abuse that weren't abuse. She is asked to leave. Somehow, the one job she could get was in Alaska. So a children's hospital in Alaska hires her to be a child abuse pediatrician there. Guess what happens there? Not just what happened in Wisconsin, but an entire staff resigned after complaints went nowhere because they said not only was she calling things abuse that weren't abuse, she was bullying her coworkers to call things abuse that weren't abuse and to say things were fractures that weren't fractures. You can look her up, Dr. Barbara Knox. You would think after those two situations where she had to leave her jobs because she kept calling things that weren't abuse, that she would be done in child abuse pediatrics. But no, guess who hires her? Florida! Wolfson's, their child protection team, thinks that Dr. Barbara Knox is the woman for them. She is going to head up their Department of Child Protection. Now she is there telling people what is child abuse or not. And guess who walks in the room when Diana's at the hospital trying to figure out why her daughter's leg is swollen? Dr. Barbara Knox. She should not be employed. She should not be anywhere near children. And after I have heard some stories about people who have been in rooms with her, how she is not in jail at this point is beyond me. Or in a mental facility. Like, there definitely seems to be something wrong with her. Not only is this woman coming in the room and telling her that her child has all of these injuries that we find out later were not all there. There was no liver laceration. There was no internal bleeding. I don't know where she came up with some of this. This woman comes in the room, puts her hand on Diana's knee, and then goes about acting out as if she was the one hurting the baby. Stands up and demonstrates drop kicking an infant. At this point, she's 12 weeks old. She's 8 pounds. She said, this is the only way your baby could have these injuries. Needless to say, they're escorted out of the hospital by police. This was October of last year. Their children are still not back with them. This is insane. I just want you to know that if you're angry after hearing what I've said to you, you are going to be angrier after you listen to the podcast. But you don't want to miss it. Do you want to miss it? You don't want to miss it. We've got to help these families. We've got to raise their voices because no one is listening. And if you had a baby, let alone one that you fought so long and hard for, and they are not in your care, and you have done nothing wrong, that is a huge injustice. Unless you want to be the next one to fear when you go to the hospital to try and get something taken care of for your kids. If you want to be worried that they're going to say something's abuse that is clearly not abuse, you should probably share this story. You should probably tell people this is happening. Help these families out. If this was you, you would want someone to help you out. After these kids were removed, a geneticist has diagnosed Amelia with osteopenia and bone demineralization. Also, Diana, knowing that she has, lived her whole life with hypermobility and symptoms that kind of lined up with what they were looking at for Amelia, she got herself tested. The genetics have confirmed, her clinical appointments have confirmed. Diana herself has a number of genetic bone disorders, including Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, hypermobility with, I think it's Marfanoid characteristics. She's been diagnosed with osteopenia, a number of things that very clearly explain that these are all medical issues. This is not abuse. She's been diagnosed, but nobody cares. They still call it child abuse. They're like, hey, just because she has fragile bones doesn't mean the parents didn't also abuse her. But the only proof of the abuse is that there were fractures.